Okay, so what next? How can we better support girls and women on the autism spectrum? I think within eating disorder services, but also in OCD services, perhaps personality disorder services, I think there are all sorts of places where undiagnosed autistic females are ending up, if you like, and I think we need to create more of a culture of skillful specialist assessment of autism within those services, because I would argue that you cannot treat that person effectively if you don't understand something as important about them as whether or not they are autistic. So I think that would be a really important step towards improving our support we offer autistic girls and women. Now, I thought I'd... There we go. What about post-diagnosis? Now, I'm very conscious that we've got all sorts of really interesting talks coming up about ways in which we can support autistic girls and women post-diagnosis. But I suppose, so I'm just going to say a few thoughts on this. So I think it's crucial that there's some sort of gender-specific psychoeducation that follows diagnosis. So an example is, I think there's, and we heard an example of this, in fact, on our panel, a very powerful and thought-provoking example of how I suspect, and there is some evidence from this, admittedly from these rather small studies, that autistic girls are at particular risk compared to autistic boys of being sort of victimized and sexually exploited. Yeah, I think that there is a greater risk by virtue, in a sense, of them being female and autistic. And so I would certainly want that to be built into standard care, psychoeducation, helping people learn ways to stay safe and to appreciate some of the risks as well as the fun that can come with going out into the world and making relationships and meeting people. I think also psychoeducation about eating disorder risk. One thing I've left off the slide, but was really hit home to me from this panel, and also was something that came up in our earlier work with the late diagnosed autistic women, was that for many of these women, the most powerful thing about receiving their diagnosis is that it had connected them with a community of other autistic people. And many of them reported that community took place online. So I think perhaps we need to really join the 21st century here and get away from this model that so many of us have been trained in of the sort of, the psychologist or the psychiatrist or the pediatrician or whatever who steps out of their waiting room, steps out of their consulting room, goes to the waiting room, picks somebody up and takes them back into the consulting room and helps them, to more kind of modern solutions where it's about trying to help people build networks, including online, that promote their well-being, that promote their resilience, promote their stigma resistance, and so on. So I think that's a really powerful potential avenue to go down that's kind of unlocked for somebody if they take on the identity of being autistic. And I've really already talked about this. So adaptation of mental health services, I think, is a really crucial step to help autistic women, but also, in fact, autistic men and boys as well, in the sense that, if one has a mental health difficulty, it has such a big impact on your quality of life. And these conditions are often, they can respond to treatment and can be helped. So if we can get better at making these services accessible so that people actually manage to get through the door and aren't kind of facing all these kind of invisible barriers because of their autism, but also to make the treatments themselves kind of appropriate to the particular mental health problems of these autistic girls and women, I think that would also be a really important step. So I'm going to end there and answer some questions. I would like to just say that questionnaire, I've put it as the Q-CAT there, I think it was called the CAT-Q in the previous one, but I think you know what I mean. The camouflaging questionnaire is available to people. If you'd like to have a look at it, do feel free to email me, because we're interested in kind of getting people's views on it and sort of getting it out there. So I'd just like to thank the people on these slides, because the work that I presented is all done as part of a kind of a series or a sort of network of collaborations. So so thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to taking some questions.
There's one question we have from our online audience. What is the percentage of diagnosed autistic women who also have an eating disorder?
Yeah,
so sort of
it's a really good question, and it always comes up. The answer is we don't know. So it's been looked at, if you like, from the point of view of what percentage of people with an eating disorder have autism. The studies have not been done where they've got a representative sample of autistic girls and women and worked out what proportion of them have an eating disorder. It's a really important question, and I happen to say that research is being done, but I don't have an answer at the moment.
And I think I know that's going to be a similar answer to this additional excellent question. Is there research on if early diagnosis or intervention reduces the risk of developing eating disorders? Yeah. So if you haven't...
Again, you know, obviously my instinct is it would, but people haven't done those studies.
Yeah. And in regard to mimicry, is the reasoning because it provides regulation, decreased anxiety, or are there additional reasons, understandings for females mimicking even subconsciously? So the question is it self-regulation or to decrease anxiety that women are mimicking others, or?
Yeah, so certainly on the evidence we have so far, you know, I suspect that the eating disorder, like any sort of outcome, is multiply determined. There'll be multiple risk factors that will kind of influence somebody's probability of developing one. And you know, one of the ideas we have is that seeking starvation as a kind of anxiety management strategy would be a clear risk factor there. I think that's interesting. I think the question was asking, do you ever get people who are almost kind of mimicking perhaps other people they know by sort of going on a diet? And again, this is anecdotal, but I've certainly spoken to some autistic women who developed an eating disorder who said that initially they kind of discovered that dieting and losing weight kind of earned them compliments and was a way in which they could almost kind of, in quite a concrete way, gain some sort of social traction, if you like, amongst their peers, and therefore they kind of got into it through that. So yes, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, I have a friend who was diagnosed with autism, and she was actually misdiagnosed with an eating disorder, and because she actually had something different, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and it was causing her actually not to be able to absorb food into her system, and she was rapidly losing weight, like on a dangerous level. And she couldn't get the treatment she wanted because everyone told her, oh, you have an eating disorder, you're just starving yourself. And people would not give her the treatment she required because also she was autistic, so they didn't understand what her language was. Is any of the studies people didn't have an eating disorder and they were like completely misdiagnosed, or they had a physical disease that prevented them from actually absorbing food? And then as she got involved, she actually met more people with this condition who also had autism. So has this ever come up?
It's not marked in the research. It's a very important point, and it seems to me that you'd think clinically it would be something that eating disorder clinicians would be kind of onto, wouldn't you? But I suppose I mean, the thing it set off in my mind was just, you know, there's a whole other area here which is about, you know, how autistic people access healthcare services and how they're helped to communicate more clearly. And you know, and that sounds like a real case where this person was not sort of given the support they needed to communicate this condition, and also sounds like not listened to.
Regarding whether camouflaging is useful or not, yes, from an autistic perspective, I would say partially it really depends on the situation. Like, are there situations where it would be dangerous to not camouflage? Would you be putting yourself at risk or endangering other people? I also think that it's kind of a vicious circle because on the one hand, as an autistic person, I want to be able to be myself and I want people to accept me as I am. On the other hand, they're not going to accept me if I don't. So it's kind of an either or. Like, I want them to accept me and they're not going to accept me unless I camouflage. So it's really, there isn't a good answer to that question.
Yeah.
I'm going to lump my kind of multiple questions together to ask about what do we know in terms of your data and the gender gap and how it closes, they're in adolescence, or even in the camouflaging measure for individuals without autism and those male-female differences.
So are you saying what's the kind of relationship, in a sense, between camouflaging on the one hand and the narrowing of that?
Yeah, do we see that? Sorry. Do we see the same pattern? Do you guys have data on individuals without autism, and do we see that same pattern between males and females? One on the SCDC, as well on thinking about higher scores and camouflaging for females without autism.
Yeah. So the data there were general population. So those were data in the general population. What we don't have, and this would be quite a hard sample to assemble, but would be brilliant, would be autistic people, but followed right through from 7 to 16. The trouble with trying to do a study like that is I think you'd miss out on a whole bunch of girls because they wouldn't be picked up till they were 12, 13, 14. The camouflaging one's a bit of a paradox in a way, isn't it? Because you might think that would sort of enhance people's or depress people's scores on an autism trait measure the more they were camouflaging. I suppose one thing is it would be interesting to measure the autistic traits in the situation by something like direct observation, because you might actually get something a bit different compared to parent report. Maybe the parents are more used to or have a better understanding of the young person without their camouflaging strategies, whereas to actually check that out in terms of someone who isn't familiar with the child but using direct observation, I think you might there see the effects of camouflaging.
Hi. I'm curious to know if there's any evidence about the age at which camouflaging begins for boys versus girls. So are girls just starting earlier in their camouflage, working with predominantly boys? I do see it later, like grade 10, 11, they kind of start to want to act more like their peers.
Yeah, that's a very
I wonder if that
interesting
just
question.
starts younger for girls.
Yeah. Again, nobody's done that work. I think it's a very good question, and it seems to me sort of an answerable question. We could. So I've often been surprised. Again, I'm talking anecdotally by talking to autistic women at how early they started with their camouflaging. I sort of initially had thought, this must be a kind of pre-adolescent thing. But no, many people talk about it being a very early feature of their experience. But yeah, really interesting point as to whether the boys kind of start to do it a bit later. Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering if the fact, how you would differentiate between the fact that perhaps older girls and women who are more skilled at or more consciously implementing camouflaging may have, I think you were saying, may have higher rates of maybe depression or anxiety. But could it also be that women and teenage girls who are using camouflaging are just also more socially aware of maybe some of the more nuanced social rejection, social challenges that they face, and therefore it's that awareness more than the actual camouflaging they're more correlated than causal? Is that?
Yes. Yeah, totally. So I think that's a really interesting point. So the idea that, in a sense, if you're a higher camouflager, perhaps you're somebody who's a bit more used to reflecting on your own internal states and so on, and therefore you could end up scoring yourself higher on a self-report depression measure than somebody else. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I think the other potential confound there is that, for example, we know that people camouflage because of bullying. So it could be another way of thinking about that relationship could be that people who've experienced more peer victimization both camouflage more and are less happy. So I think we're going to need to use longitudinal designs to try and tease apart how these different variables fit together. And I remember again one person talking to me about how she used camouflaging at the sort of start of a relationship to kind of create a sort of connection, and then would try not to then feel that she was locked into camouflaging for the entire relationship. And that struck me as a very sensible way to go. And so I began to think, maybe there's different ways in which you use camouflaging, the flexibility with which you use it or when you use it and so on, that could also be pretty important variables for deciding whether it kind of works for you or doesn't.
Hi. I'm good to talk. Okay. So part of this conversation makes me a little crazy because we're talking to the young women about whether or not they should camouflage and to fit in, as it were, and avoid bullying or victimization or whichever. And I'm thinking that's in some ways so wrong because, first of all, it takes so much energy. And I mean, I realize I'm speaking to the wrong people here, but just for me, we have no space in our society for people who are different, and it's quite tragic.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you asked the question because I didn't mean at all to position myself as sort of saying it's great that everybody's camouflaging to fit in.
I didn't think you did.
Okay, yeah. But it is, I agree. You know, but there must be ways in which, we've seen in other areas, and I suppose, gay rights is another obvious one where certainly in certain parts of the world, things have changed quite a lot recently. And people, to put it as they don't have to camouflage as much as they used to. So it'll be interesting to see. And there is, I think that to me, like since I came into autism research, one of the biggest changes has been the fact that the autism community does have a growing voice. I think partly through the online world, actually, and social media and so on. And there's more of a neurodiversity movement. So that's got to be the best chance, I think, of slightly widening the bandwidth, if you like, of kind of what acceptable behavior is.
So, and part of that, which I totally support, but is that the camouflage maybe doesn't come off quite right anyway. So even though, in particular, a young woman I know, she's working really hard, but even so, her peers, it's just she's not quite pulling it off. But
yes, yeah.
This is kind of related to what she was talking about, and for me, one of the things that stands out is that we're actually doing a lot of therapy that teaches kids with ASD to camouflage. So for example, social skills, flexibility, these are all things that don't come naturally to them, and then they have to work hard at them for the rest of their lives. Speaking to experts in social skills, they've often said this is a lifelong learning, that they're going to need support in this for the rest of their life. And you're actually teaching them skills of how to participate in conversations, how to look at people, how to continue conversations. I mean, we're actually teaching them these skills. So with the question that should they be camouflaging, it's hard for them, it's stressful, but we're actually focusing our therapy on that right now.
Yeah, interesting one. I mean, my hope for this camouflaging research is that once we're a few more years down the road and we have a better understanding of kind of what different parts of camouflaging there are, what are the more adaptive ways of using it, what are the ones that are less adaptive, is that we could then co-produce social skills training groups with autistic people, so that you're really developing a social skills program that's based on kind of lots and lots of expertise of autistic people kind of working out, their camouflaging strategies. So it would be less of a kind of neurotypicals imposing, this is how you enter a conversation, this is what you need to do, this is how you make a play date or whatever, to something that's a bit more organically grown out of what autistic people themselves have found helpful and works. So I think that to me is the great promise of this research. Because as I understand it, while social skills groups are really useful, there is a bit of a question hanging over them as to what extent the skills learnt in groups generalize and so on. So maybe this could inject some extra insights into the whole kind of field of social skills training. Because surely, again, I'd be very interested, we probably don't have time now, but to hear from, well, we did have a comment indeed from an autistic person saying that you kind of, it does help to have some of these sort of tricks and skills and abilities because you kind of need them to rub along in the world. So I wouldn't be, sort of anti-social skills training overall.